We will be recording this session, and I just started that right now, and it will be posted on our PERC YouTube page. You'll probably see it there after this weekend sometime. I will be moderating the chat, and feel free to send any questions my way if you'd like. But Steve would also like to encourage a free and open discussion. And he asks that if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself, throw yourself up there on video, jump right in. He really wants this to be an open forum that we have today. We will also have time at the end of this presentation for Q&A. So if you have questions that don't seem to fit naturally throughout, you can always hold them, and we'll certainly have a session at the end to address those. At the conclusion of today's program, please do head on over to our website, which is percdublin.org, and fill out an evaluation of today's program. On that evaluation, there's a section where you can let us know what type of future programming you would like to see, and we really do want to hear from you to know what you would like to see PERC support for our community. Also, if you'd like to be on our mailing list for future presentations, you can email volunteer@percdublin.org. And Kathy, would you mind just throwing that in the chat, that email address? That way folks can see that, and they can certainly send us an email and let us know. And my last bit of housekeeping is we have one last final upcoming program for this school year. It will be on March 11th, again at 9:30 a.m. or 7 p.m., and it will be addressing screen time in your children. And this topic is especially relevant during these COVID times with increased screen time. Now I will turn it over to Steve to get us started on diversity and inclusion.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for joining today. I want to reiterate what Carrie talked about in terms of participation and engagement. Also, I'd like to ask those who, are willing to do so to turn on your video. Part of engagement is to look people in the eye and assess how engaged they are, whether they're buying in or not, or whether they're reading their email or playing video games while I'm talking or not. So, I've seen it all. So if you're willing and able to do that, and if your morning face doesn't harm anybody too much, feel free to turn on your video so we can really engage face to face. Also, how many of you have a bank account? Great. How many of you know that you cannot withdraw more from your bank account than what's on deposit? The goal for this workshop is to increase the deposits that you have to withdraw from your DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion bank account. And that depends solely on how much you participate, engage, ask questions, become involved, volunteer. So we will be asking for volunteers during the morning. So just be in tune with that and remember about your bank account. We're going to start with an icebreaker, and I'm going to ask for volunteers right off the bat, maybe 4 volunteers to do what we call, let me identify myself. And so I'm going to role play this for you, but I'll go through the prompts for you. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to self-describe your cultural orientation. I'm not going to explain to you what that means to you. I want you to describe yourself in any way that you feel you need to based on what you consider to be your cultural orientation. The second thing you'll do when you identify yourself is share a common stereotype about your culture. Common stereotype. Third, you're going to share with us an aspect of your culture that would tend to debunk or disprove that stereotype. And I'll role play and give you an example. I identify myself as an African-American male, heterosexual, Christian, married, from the Midwest. Mother grew up in Selma, Alabama. Father grew up in Richmond, Kentucky on a farm. 2 adult children. I'm a lawyer. Stereotype is I'm 6'3.5", African American male. So the first question I generally get when I meet people is, "Hey, did you play ball?" And to debunk that, no, although I do have skills on the basketball court, don't get me wrong, I am a lawyer. So, I dare say that if I put a hoodie on and went into the grocery store, people probably wouldn't depict me as a lawyer. They depict me probably as something else that's not so, complimentary as being a lawyer. So who wants to volunteer? I want 4 volunteers to identify themselves. Culture orientation, stereotype, and aspect that debunks the stereotype. And I'll just wait and listen. Actually, you have to do this out loud so everybody can hear you.
I'll go first if no one else wants to jump in.
Go right ahead.
Hi, my name is Tara. I am a cisgender female. I come from Ireland, so a stereotype of Irish people is definitely that we drink too much. I tend to just make fun of that when people say it, but it's partially true, so I can't really complain too much about the stereotype. Yeah, that's all I got.
So it's not completely true, huh?
Not entirely true.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll go. My name is Heather, and I am from a very small town in Ohio, a very rural area. We had one stoplight. I went to graduated with 60 students in my class, and so a stereotype would be that, maybe not very educated and somewhat backwards in my belief, and that my education was a little bit substandard, but I have a degree from Purdue University and a master's degree from the Ohio State University, and am very passionate about education. So,
Thank you. Who's next? 2 more.
Good morning. My name is Melissa. I grew up in a middle-class family with 2 loving parents. One's on this call right now because I love my mom. Hi. A description that sometimes I have is a middle-class white stay-at-home wife, and being that stereotype that people think I just play tennis and go to yoga and don't do much and just get to meet with my girlfriends through the day. But as some of you know me on the phone, I break that stereotype very much because I'm involved in, I feel, every committee and every volunteer opportunity. So I don't sit at home and play tennis and go to yoga and probably take care of myself as much as I'm supposed to because I spend most of my time volunteering for the community.
So you're not one of those desperate housewives that I've seen on TV, huh?
Definitely not.
Thank you, Melissa. Who's next? Last one. Maybe we can get a male to identify themselves. How about that? I believe in diversity.
I think that's what you call peer pressure. I'll go. I don't know how many other males are on, but I know that I am one. I'm Isao Shoji. I have, I come from a Taiwanese Japanese background. Born in Taiwan, raised in Japan, and obviously an immigrant to the US. I suppose a typical stereotype is that I am short. Unfortunately, I am, but I got over that when I got married. I'm okay with it now. And I also get a lot of, hey, are you a doctor, or are you an engineer, or are you a college professor type of question, or an assumption. I am none of those, although I did I did pursue medicine for a while. I chose not to finish that path. I deal with people's money now, which I think is relatively rare in our, I guess, cultural makeup in this country anyway.
Thank you very much. Well, as you can see, and thank you for volunteering to identify yourself. This exercise attempts to get people, firstly, away from race, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, because that really doesn't tell anything about who a person is. Those are made up, non-real categories that we've created over centuries to put people in certain boxes so that we can either manipulate them, discriminate against them, be superior to them, etc. So race is not real. And so we'd rather explore what we call our cultural orientation. We heard Irish, we heard small rural town, we heard middle class, white stay-at-home mom, and we've got a Japanese Thai immigrant. With that, oh, you must be a doctor engineer because you're Asian, and that's what Asian folks do, right? So one thing that we do when we allow others to identify themselves is it prevents us from imposing our own stereotypical labels on them. And people want to identify themselves, and they want to be proud of their cultural orientation, what they're really made of, versus those nondescript Black, white, Asian, Hispanic labels that the census puts on us. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. The other lesson here is that we all, regardless of if we're from Japan, Ireland, a small rural town where there were Black, white, whatever, those fake racial categories that I talked about, we all battle stereotypes all of our lives. We try to outlive that image that we're not, uneducated just because we come from a small rural town. We're not a stay-at-home mom because we're middle class. In fact, we're very advocacy minded and community service minded. We don't drink a lot because we're from Ireland. Not too much anyway, right? And it's those kinds of things that we try to outlive and battle every single day of our lives. And so we need to encourage people to identify themselves as they want to be identified, and prevent our stereotypes from creeping in and putting people into stereotypical boxes. And we'll talk about boxes later on in the workshop. How many of you learned something about your colleague that you may not have known before based on them identifying themselves? So that's kind of what happens when we let people express themselves and describe who they are versus us imposing our stereotypical or biases on them. Any questions? And as Carrie said, this isn't a monologue. I don't do monologues. I do a facilitation of workshops. So I'm guiding the group as they want to be guided. I take them in the direction they want to go, just keeping them inside the curb so that nobody has an accident. So next slide. We're going to discuss fundamental concepts. First, diversity is a fact. And I like to say this because no walls, laws, executive orders, anything like that can prevent the inevitable diversification of our society, even Dublin. And so I've been a resident of, I was a resident of Dublin for over 20 years. My kids both went through the Dublin schools, Deer Run, Griselle, Jerome. So I've seen both of my sons grow up from little toddlers to adults in the school system. Great schools, great community, but it is more and more diverse. You guys got 23% Asian population in Dublin, Ohio, for a variety of different reasons. Honda is one big reason, and their supplier base, which I worked at for years. But that's a real huge asset, that diversity. So once we reckon with the first step of the 12-step process and understand that diversity is a fact, then we can realize that it's valuable, that it adds value. It's, when we are faced with differences, we need to be curious about those differences, not try to stay away from or be repelled by those differences or call those differences bad, right? Or less than. And so we want to understand that diversity is a fact and it's valuable, and we'll talk about how valuable it is later. The next thing we'll be talking about is inclusion is an act. So while diversity is a noun, it's a state of being, it's who we are, based on who we are, where we come from, inclusion is an act. I can't put a poster in all the halls of all the Dublin schools and say, wow, the poster says we're inclusive, so we must be inclusive. That was easy. No, that's not how it works. Inclusion takes affirmative action from each stakeholder, students, parents, teachers, faculty, to make sure that there is an open, welcoming, appreciative environment that has an open mind to different points of view, that involves people in decision-making, problem solving, creation of new ideas and initiatives for the students, that has a diverse school board that really invites all views across the stakeholder community to make the school district better. The next concept we'll talk about is equity. And at our firm, we say diversity is a fact, inclusion is an act, and equity must be exact. What do we mean by that? I can't take something off the shelf at Walmart and say, Melissa, this is for you for the rest of your life. Good luck. We give everybody the same thing. We don't discriminate here. We treat everybody the same. We don't see color here. We don't see gender. We just give everybody the same, regardless of their situation or circumstances. That's counter to everything that equity stands for. We must meet our students, our faculty, our employees within the school district where they are on that diverse, unique perspective, and provide them with the opportunity that they need to be successful or to access the same opportunity. Another analogy is we don't start at the same place, but we must have access to the same opportunity. And then lastly, race is a social construct. And so we'll get into a discussion about race being a social construct. The next slide, we learned that for hundreds of years, we've been told that each race is a discrete group of people defined by specific genetic and biological differences. So we've used this as a way to explain observed differences in people. In the early 1800s, Dr. Samuel Morton conducted research that was flawed. He based his findings on, those findings were used actually to justify hundreds of years of horrors like slavery and genocide. Now, it's a social construct, this thing called race, because it's humanly invented. It's a classification system. It's invented as a way to define physical differences, but is more used as a tool for oppression and violence. Trick question. Has anybody seen evidence of violence lately in the news based solely on race? This thing called race? This paradox, and I hate to use these $50 words, but you guys are very educated, so you understand. This paradox where race is both not biologically real and yet incredibly socially and politically real is what makes daily life challenging for all of us who desire to establish our own self-identity. Remember, let me identify myself? That's what we strive to do. We strive to reach out beyond the stereotypes and tell people who we really are, because we're proud of our culture, right? But this thing called race boxes in. Now, politically and socially, it's real. I get that. But we must try to break away from this thing called race because it's a cancer to our society. I just read an article where there's a lot of uptick in racial violence against Asian Americans, you know, in places like Oakland, San Francisco, and Chinatowns all over the country, just because people are associating them with being responsible for the COVID-19 virus. You know, senseless violence against Asian folks just because they're this thing called race that we categorize them as Asian.
Hey,
So
Steve,
anyway,
it looks like we have a question. Tara, go ahead.
So do you think that we should not be using those categories like in forms and things like that, where we ask, you know, people to identify their race? Or do you think there's still benefit to that to be able to help people based on their, well, how they self-identify, whether they need certain things on those forms? But
that's a great
trying to gather
question.
that data.
Why don't we go to the next prompts on this slide, because it'll explain that question in real good detail. So the census, opportunistically, the census was just conducted in 2020. So I'll answer that question by asking another question. Are you white or are you an Irish and Polish American? So what I suggest people do is, yeah, society forces us to use these boxes, but we have to lobby to include the ability to further describe our culture or our ethnicity. So why not be able to say white, Irish, Polish, right? In parentheses or whatever you want to do. How many of you know that white tells you nothing, but Irish, Polish American tells you a whole lot, right? You can work with that. Are you Black or are you an American-born daughter of Asian and Jamaican American immigrants? Does anybody know who that second line describes in real life today? Scream it out if you do. You're on mute, I think.
Our vice president.
That's right, Kamala Harris. She has a father who was a Jamaican immigrant, and her mother was an Asian immigrant. But that tells you a whole lot, and it was Asian Indian, not Asian Pacific Islander. So there's all kinds of spin-offs within the Asian culture, as there is Hispanic. Hispanic is one of the most diverse diasporas out there. Are you Hispanic or are you of Bolivian and Cuban descent? We have a Festival Latino here in Columbus every August, and Honda used to be a founding, you know, a headline presenting sponsor of that. And I would go every year, and I have a lot of really good relationships within the Hispanic community to just look at the broad variety of Hispanic residents that we have in Central Ohio. It's amazing. And that's one of the biggest Latino festivals in the state. So we should be proud of that heritage that we have right in our backyard. So yeah, to answer your question, politically and socially, we have to deal with these boxes called race, but I encourage you to expound upon that in your own way. And we need to lobby our legislators to allow us to explain what that white, Black, Asian means in more detail, because that adds uniqueness and value to what we bring to the table. Any other questions? Yeah.
I see we do have another question. Go ahead, Janet.
So if you have African Americans who have been here for a very long time, but have no idea of what their cultural heritage is because their ancestors were brought here by force as slaves, how do you reconcile that in trying to identify yourself?
That's a great point. I can't tell you how many times I've been at the water fountain on a Monday morning after the weekend, particularly in the summer, and I hear a coworker say, "Hey, I just came back from the old country. We went to Sicily where my great-great-grandfather was, and we saw all our relatives." I can't do that because my lineage has been abruptly disconnected by slavery. So I can do that ancestry, you know, whatever, and try to piece it together, but there's no direct tie because of this thing called slavery, to your point. So I describe myself as an African American because that's as far back as I know. And my mother was from Kentucky. I'm sorry, my father was Kentucky. My mother was from Selma. In fact, my mother was friends with Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife. And they grew up playing together in Selma, Alabama. Um, but you know, we can't go too far back unless we do some really good research, or unless our elders are still around to help us piece that story together.
Hey, Steve, we have another question. Go ahead, Peggy.
Hi, Steve. Question for you regarding the design of our federal census. And I'm thinking about how those classifications for race are often, and the data collected from that are often used for federal funding and state funding for programs to serve social programs and federal programs to serve communities based on that racial composition and racial data. So how do we redesign that to include our ethnicity, but still make sure the programs are being funded?
Yeah, like I said, I think that until we can really, over a long period of time, gravitate away from race, we have to use these Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, and two or more. Who in the hell is that? I don't understand what two or more is, but that actually gets to the point that I'm making. If they have a two or more category on the census, why can't we expound upon what white means or what black means? So categorically, to distribute benefits to certain communities that are disproportionately impacted, we may need to keep that black, white, whatever, but we should be able to expound upon that in parentheses as to what aspect of blackness we claim we are, what aspect of the Asian culture we comprise, what type of Hispanic are we within that broad, diverse ethnicity. So that's, I think, the best solution until we eventually start gravitating away from these boxes called race. I hope that helps. Let's go to the next slide. And we're going to just talk a little bit about, this thing called Black Lives Matter. And I think Carrie's going to pull up an illustration that I'll walk us through. So, can everybody see that? And a gentleman named Doug Williford, and many of you may have seen this before, he had a very unique perspective on Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. And so he talks about it in these terms. If my wife comes to me in obvious pain and asks, "Do you love me, dear?" An answer of "I love everyone, sweetie," would be truthful, but also hurtful and cruel in the moment. Also might think that he's having an affair, right? Or something like that. If a coworker comes to me upset and says, "My father just died," a response of "everyone's parents die" would be truthful, but very hurtful and cruel in the moment. So when a friend of any race, gender, sexual orientation speaks up in a time of obvious pain and hurt and says, "Black Lives Matter," a response of "All Lives Matter," or for that matter, "Blue Lives Matter," is truthful, but it's hurtful and cruel in the moment. I hope that perspective helps others, because it helped me look at this thing called Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter a little differently. I used to be Chief Diversity Officer for the City of Columbus, and I did ride along several of them with our fine Columbus police officers. I have immeasurable respect for them and the job that they do. They leave their house every day not knowing if they're going to come back home. The odds are really, really stacked against them when they go out there, because they deal with all kinds of different things. I get it. But because of what we've been seeing weekly, daily, monthly, yearly on our TV, unarmed folks getting killed, asphyxiated on video, it makes one believe that Black lives don't matter. Now, I want to examine the word matter. This phrase, Black Lives Matter, is not saying Black lives are better than, Black lives are worth more, Black lives are superior to. It simply says Black lives matter. So there's a baseline that this phrase speaks to that people don't seem to be observing based on what's happening in real time today. So this is from Doug Williford. I thought it was instructive. Anybody have any questions or thoughts on this? Comments?
I think this example breaks it down really easily for people and allows a lot of people to get it.
You know, there is also a element of white fragility, and I don't know if any of you have read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. It's a very, very good book. But the dominant white culture in our country is not used to having other cultures mentioned so frequently. I had a client one time and we were in a workshop and he said, "Give me a break. Black Lives Matter. I'm sick of it. It's on the basketball court. It's on the football field. It's on their helmets, on their shoes. You know, they're shoving it down my throat. Give me a break." And that's a prime example of folks getting kind of uncomfortable because Black folk are usually just invisible except for Black History Month, right? And so they haven't had to have it talked about that much. And so it's not a matter of rubbing it in anybody's face. It's to bring it to the forefront of how people are feeling. And when you equivocate by saying all lives matter in response, you're robbing that person of their truth. That, and according to what they see, it doesn't appear that Black lives matter at all. That's their truth based on their orientation, where they sit. And again, whites, LGBTQs, Hispanics, all kinds of people have been saying this phrase. It's not just Black folks saying it. So let's move on. Now I wanted to get into the t-shirt issue, the infamous or famous, however you want to categorize it. I talked to Dr. Hoadley about this. I've talked to the City of Dublin folks about it. I'm supporting them with some diversity, equity, inclusion work. And what I told the City of Dublin folks is, hey, what's going on in the schools directly impacts what's going on in the City of Dublin. How many of you know, myself included, that many folks moved to Dublin because of the quality of the schools? So that's a huge determining factor in whether people want to even live in Dublin. And so when this t-shirt issue happened, I think it was unfortunate. But I want to get others' opinion on what they feel about what happened related to this t-shirt. Anybody want to weigh in? Again, this is a Las Vegas zone. What goes here stays here. You know, feel free to express yourself and remember the bank account rule, because I need to hear from you and you need to hear from each other to get different perspectives on this issue. So I'll just shut up and listen.
I was very disappointed that the teachers were not supported in what they were trying to do.
And somebody asked, can I explain what happened with the t-shirt issue? Can you explain what happened for everybody?
I don't know the great detail of it, but what I know is that the teachers were trying to show their support for LGBT students and Black students in the schools by wearing these t-shirts. They had coordinated to wear them all on one day, and it blew up on social media that it wasn't appropriate for teachers to be doing this and indoctrinating the students with their own beliefs. And it just kind of spiraled from there, in my opinion. It was it went to dark, dark places that I didn't imagine it could have gone to when it was trying to be a good thing. But my biggest disappointment about the whole thing was that our teachers were not supported in the beautiful thing that they were trying to do to support marginalized students.
Yeah, from what I understand, an African-American student at one of the schools in the system created this T-shirt, and it has all kinds of phrases that support. I think Black Lives Matter is actually on the T-shirt as one of the phrases, and there's LGBTQ proponent statements. There's a gender equality statements on there. There's all kinds of things represented, and some teachers, including these teachers, wanted to wear the shirt in solidarity and support of the students. And I think the school board came down on it from a legal opinion that while it's okay for the students to wear it, the district can't wear it because they would be, quote unquote, taking a position or advocating one position over another. One thing that struck me was I heard that some input was they felt love is love, which is on the T-shirt, was in the context of promoting pedophilia, and that kind of blew my mind because that didn't come to my mind when I read that statement. But so be it. So anyway, that's kind of the background as I understand it. And thank you for trying to expound upon that, Tara. I appreciate it. Any other comments?
I think the way that it was handled was a setback for our community and for our district. And it wasn't moving us forward and looking at issues that are going on today. I think it was definitely a setback.
Tell me more. How do you think it was a setback?
I think kind of like what Tara was saying, just not the opportunity to support all those that live in our community and their different backgrounds and who they are. And I just think that it was, our board took, I don't want to say the easy way out, but the kind of that mentality some people have, like, well, this is the way it's always been done, the legal way, let's just push this under the rug instead of really tackling it and having the hard conversations. And so, yeah, I think it was more of a setback for our community.
And I do see a lot of things coming up in the chat box, and I appreciate your input. Maybe one more, thought before we move on.
I'd like to say, hi, this is Peggy. I'd like to say that I feel like it was a blatant example of how polarized we are, not only in our country, but in our community. And we're not talking about that here. We talk about it in the broader scope of what's happening at the national level, but what is happening here in our community, nobody wants to discuss it. It's too uncomfortable. Let's shut it down. Let's take away the shirt and not have the discussion. That's what I saw.
Yeah, I represent school district. I have a engagement with the Ohio School Boards Association, and you wouldn't believe how many school districts have this sort of posture. Those people on the other side of the river, right? And I know that there's a river that runs through the Dublin district, right? And I understand that the same sentiment is really, real within the Dublin City Schools district. Those people on the west side of the river, those people on the east side of the river. That's that divisive posture that I don't think is helpful, because there is a lot to be learned from different perspectives. And so instead of, again, remember the diversity definition, when you're faced with differences, be curious about those differences. Don't build a fence, up against those differences. Anyway, let's move on to the next slide. I wanted to examine the Dublin City Schools multicultural / inclusionary policy. And I'll just touch on the highlights, but I'll let you kind of soak in on that paragraph to just get a gist of what policy 2211 indicates. But the emphasized part, the pluralism of cultures. Remember what we've been talking about, our cultural orientation. It doesn't say the pluralism of races. The pluralism of cultures has been an essential ingredient in the development of our society. That means it's a good thing and is reflected in the public schools. So it's great that this policy recognizes upfront that there is richness and value in pluralization of cultures or cross-culturalization. The next paragraph talks about the concept of pluralism has been traditionally described by the use of a term called multicultural education. And the board believes that the idea of pluralism is larger and more encompassing than multicultural education. It should be expanded to focus on an inclusionary philosophy of education. Inclusion, one of the three things that we're going to be talking about, diversity, equity, inclusion, is a philosophy whereby our district staff should promote equity and access for all students, regardless of race and all those other categories that we tend to ascribe to. So on this slide, any observations on this policy and how you as PERC view this policy? Do you see it coming to life in the schools? Do you see it reflected in what your students tell you when they come home? Do you see this actually as true, or is it aspirational? Anybody have any thoughts?
I have some thoughts. Hi, my name is Jenny. I feel like at the elementary level, it's very successful. I volunteer at, my kids have gone through Penny, and I volunteer over at Riverside with some readers. And there were often art projects and classroom projects that focused on where I came from, who I am, what I like to eat, who I know, what I know, that kind of thing. So I feel like at an elementary level, it's implemented pretty well, or at least attempted to. But as the kids age and start getting more opinionated in middle school and high school, I don't feel like there's a lot of follow through with it.
So the
because I have kids.
The older they get, the innocence just disappears the older they get, huh?
Well, or it's just that maybe it's not talked about as much. Once the kids get into middle school and high school, there's not as much focus on who I am, because I don't know, maybe they feel like they've already touched on that, so they're moving on. I have no idea. I just know, having a child, an 8th grader and a sophomore, they don't seem to really talk about that anymore, but it was a big topical conversation when they were in elementary school.
Here's a trick question. How many of you would agree that the society at large outside of Dublin is much more diverse than Dublin? And the job, one of the big jobs for the Dublin school system is to prepare those students for a very diverse world, a very diverse society. Many of them will be leaving this community. Some may stay and work right here in Dublin, but many of them will be going out into that increasingly diverse world. And so that's why this policy is so important. Let's go to the next slide. The board believes and declares, so these are directives, sort of. A multicultural inclusionary education is of vital importance to the process of development of all students and staff, sort of what I was just talking about. Number 2, the achievement of harmony within our community, that expands beyond, sort of the school buildings and into sort of society or community. And third, the stability and success of our nation. So that's that national scope. And they believe that this is important to prepare their students for that. Next prompt. Infusion of specific content throughout the district's curriculum will promote acceptance, understanding, cooperation, and appreciation of diverse groups of people. That's a very important element that should be front and center in our educational curriculum at our schools, not just Dublin, but in all districts. That's part of my job in working with school districts to make sure that their curriculum and their instruction has that multicultural inclusionary approach. Next prompt. Administrators, teacher, and other staff should receive professional development training, which will enable them to foster understanding or better understanding. And let me just say something about training. I like to consider it as professional development. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a bad thing. It's not, when we say those words, we're not fixing a problem. We're not reprimanding people for doing things bad. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is a critical success factor. It's a core competency that individuals must have to better address the needs of a diverse society. So we believe that this is important professional development because of the increasing diversification of our society. Remember I said no walls, laws, executive orders will prevent the diversification of our society. And there's plenty of data points on the diversification of our society and that we will be a minority majority country by 2060. Plenty of data on that. So finally, a philosophy of education that supports inclusionary practices can only be developed through a total school and community commitment. So that's where the parents come in. A lot of stuff that I do with school districts, if the parents, in other words, if there's a diversity committee, unless the parents and students are represented on that committee, it's a non-starter, right? Because the administration can't in a vacuum try to come up with policies and procedures that's good for students unless the students and the parents are involved. So any discussion on this slide? Any thoughts?
I have a quick question about who is included in the individuals that receive professional development training. Is that required of the board members for the school board? Like, do they have that training? I don't know. I don't have kids in school, obviously.
I've been supporting Dr. Holy with some diversity training, and I'm about to have a 4th session. We've done primary and secondary schools, and I think we've done some of the administrators and board members. However, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that there is a job posting out for a diversity, equity, inclusion coordinator for the school district. And that person, when they come in, will really roll up their sleeves and develop a strategic plan for DEI, determine what type of training is needed and who the stakeholders are that need to be involved in those professional development sessions. So to answer your question, I think it's yes. And, there might be a need to have a special session for parents, separate and apart from what the students get, separate and apart from what the staff and faculty get. So that's going to be largely dependent upon what that diversity coordinator thinks is in the best interest, which I'm very much looking forward to.
I think another group that really could benefit from some DEI training is our leaders in our PTOs and our booster clubs. I think those areas, they really do, they're a huge extension of our schools in the culture and how inclusive they are or exclusive. Sometimes those groups, I think, are the biggest offenders of being very exclusive and hard to get into and barriers to entry, but they create a huge cultural extension of the schools that they are. And we're very lucky that we have such a big district. However, those, from looking at like a PTO perspective or a booster's perspective, some schools can raise more money than another school, and it creates a huge divide between those PTOs, the activities, the enrichment that's offered to students across the district. So I think that's a huge area to take a look at.
How many of you agree that there is sort of an us versus them or those people type of mindset within the school district? Really divided by that river that
Yes.
runs through it.
Definitely. Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the next slide.
I have a quick question before we move on.
Yes.
So how do you get buy-in from, like, if you offer diversity training for parents, how do you get buy-in from people that might not believe it's important or might not be fully invested in that effort? There's a lot of people on this call, but I feel like some of the people that need to be on the call may not be on the call. How do you move forward with that? That's the thing that I find the most challenging. I've tried to reach out personally and I just don't get very far.
Yeah, that's a great question. Is it Leslie? The DEI is very much of a top-down, bottom-up type of work. So it has to start with the board and Dr. Hoadley. And then it has to also, from the groundswell, be supported by those parents and students. And so you're working the top and the bottom towards the middle. At the City of Columbus, I used to advocate that Mayor Ginther work with public-private partners in a public-private partnership to have a outside-in approach to buy-in. By that, I mean, we have corporations and other, academia and all those segments of our society on board, and the folks in, Columbus 2020 and all those corporate folks pledging their commitment to diversity. And so if you're outside of that group looking in, as they close in with that commitment, it's almost like turning the light on and seeing the roaches scatter, right? I mean, you eventually either, call people out by, if you're not for us, you're against us, or they find out that maybe if they're so strongly in their position, this is not the community for them and they may leave, who knows? But it's up to them. And it has to be a clear directive, top down, bottom up, that this is who Dublin City Schools is. This is the new way of us doing business. Remember, it's a critical success factor. It's a core competency. And so we want this for our children. That's what this policy said. We need this for harmony within our community, for success and stability of our nation. So they're recognizing this in the policy, and people have to nod their head and agree, or else they might be part of the problem.
Steve.
Yes.
Good morning, it's Eric.
Hey, Eric.
Quick question. So kind of following up on your statement of the top down, bottom up philosophy. As I read this policy that's set forth, it's a great policy. It's top down, right? I kind of, before your statement, I was thinking of, trickle down economics from back in the Reagan years. Where's the punch as to, right, we believe this as a board, we declare this, et cetera, et cetera. Are they going to also, is there a corollary where they are going to not only provide the training to staff and teachers and students, but is this going to become a part infused in the curriculum such that all of the teachers are going to have to educate our students on certain aspects? And I don't really know how to define multicultural versus inclusionary, et cetera. But right, if there's no carrot or there's no stick that's forcing educators to teach this type of information to our students, it doesn't matter how great the board policy is written. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Eric, and thank you for bringing that up. It almost gets back to the inclusion, the definition of inclusion. I can't put a poster on the wall. I can't put this policy on the wall and say, we're good. No, this has to be lived, breathed, modeled, walked, talked by everybody. And I tell my clients this, the how-to for diversity, equity, inclusion is maybe 20, 30% at the most. The commitment that has to be modeled, walked, talked, lived, breathed by every stakeholder is that 80 to 70%, 70 to 80%. And guess what? That 70 to 80% ain't my responsibility. It's yours. And so if you want to live out this statement, you're going to have to do it in a way that's crystal clear from the top down. Zero tolerance. You're going to have to police and hold each other accountable. You're going to have to hold your kids accountable. You know, I can't tell you how, well, there was a rural school district that I represented, and they were coming to school based on what they heard at the dinner table, right? And regardless of what we try to do within the school system, they were going back home and getting deprogrammed back into, you know, the racist ideology that comes from their dinner table conversation. So, like I said, those parents are critically important in making this work, right? Now, another thing, Eric, I represent the city of Dublin, and I've told them that it's critically important to collaborate with the school district, because so goes the school, so goes Dublin, right? And so maybe the city could offer community-wide, you know, implicit bias training or community-wide cultural competence training to support that external community element of this professional development that must go on, and that may be outside the means or the purview of the Dublin City Schools. But there has to be collaboration and partnership between the municipality and the school district. And in a lot of municipalities, the school district is a separate entity, just as it was in Columbus. So we had to partner with them to make sure that there was a lockstep, all in the same direction approach to solving these issues.
Roger that. Thank you, Steve.
Let's go forward to the next few slides. And diversity is value. And I'm going to try to define these terms, but I would submit that the Dublin City Schools must find definitions for these key terms, because I could ask every one of you on this call to define it, these words, and you would all invariably come up with a slightly different definition. And so it's very hard to herd those cats in the same direction if everybody thinks differently about what these words mean. So it's not a bullseye on the back for a white male. It's not a lottery ticket for the Asian female. It's none of those. It adds to what is missing within the district, or it adds to what is lacking in the city. So that add to is valuable. Different backgrounds, that's the EEO definition, right? Races, genders, gender identities, etc. But this proposed definition, that's the next prompt, is unique differences in thought, beliefs, values, life experience, etc., among many other human and cultural characteristics based on who we are. That's the DNA. That's why some of us are light skin, dark skin, stringy hair, curly hair, blue eyes, brown eyes, tall, short, fat or fatter like me, and skinny. And where we come from is the side of the railroad tracks, the side of the river that we come from, the dinner table conversation, the churches we worship at, the clubs we belong to, you know, that forms where we come from. So that makes up diversity. So can anybody tell me what's slightly different about that proposed definition than the one right above it?
Steve, I do have a critique of that revised definition, and I know there are some some good differences, but I kind of cringe at the removal of the word abilities, because I was already thinking in the previous slides about how bias against those with disabilities has not been addressed yet. So in looking at that original definition of diversity, I thought, okay, well, there's abilities, but I see that disappear in the proposed definition. And I think we do have still a culture of stigma for those against those with disabilities, whether those are intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities or what have you. So I'm kind of disappointed to see that disappear.
Great point. I can't read your first name. What is your name?
Heather.
Heather. Great point, Heather. And I saw something flash on the chat box that race is not in the proposed definition. Race or gender is not listed. And I'll explain why that's important. And I'll get to Heather's point right now. My rule of thumb as a diversity consultant is less is more when you're doing definitions. So to your point, I can include abilities or disabilities, and I guarantee you that the more things I try to include in that, there's going to be somebody that says, oh, well, what about this? You left out that. So less is more because we cover sort of the whole landscape when we say among many other human and cultural characteristics. So that kind of hopefully covers the whole landscape. And so when folks read that definition, they can imagine themselves in it. They don't have to literally see the word. They can imagine themselves. So unique differences, I wanted to talk about the word unique. Unique has a special context to it versus, oh, Heather, she's different, right? That's not very positive. But unique differences gives a special characteristic to something, right? It's like none other, right? And so we like to refer to uniqueness when we talk about diversity because that gives a special redeeming quality to it. And beliefs, values, thoughts, life experiences. Can anybody tell me if they can see thoughts, values, life experiences, beliefs? Can you see those things? No, we want to focus on the things about diversity that escape the naked eye. Because really, and there's an iceberg theory that we use in diversity, we make 90% of our judgments based on only the 10% that we see above the waterline of the iceberg. Yet, the 90% is those thoughts, beliefs, values, experiences that really make up the essence of who we are. That's that unique value that we bring, not what we see on the color or the gender radar, but what's inside, right? Who we really are culturally. So I hope that helps. And let's go to the next definition, equity. Like I said, our firm indicates that equity is exact, engaging people and circumstances. So it's very important to know that both people require equity and circumstances or systems require equity. And let's go to the proposed definition, ensuring that people and circumstances are provided with exactly what they need, not that generic Walmart thing that I took off the shelf. To gain access to opportunity, be successful, have a full life through understanding fair is not always equal. I'll repeat that, fair is not always equal, and that equity is not the same as equality. And the next slide demonstrates that visually. Equality, many of you have probably seen this. Everybody has the same box, that Walmart example. I give everybody the same. I don't see differences. I don't see diversity. I'm colorblind, right? Equity, I take the colorblind glasses off and I look at each other's unique circumstances, and I know the tall guy doesn't even need a box. The short guy needs two, and the baby bear needs two, and the mama bear, is just right with that one. However, if we think outside the box, and if we have the opportunity to look at equity in systems and rules and guidelines, we would discover Why do we need a fence at all? We save material cost on fence building. We save material costs in buying crates, and everybody enjoys the game, right? That's total liberation, or they've also referred to that slide as justice. So any thoughts about that visual? Okay, and it takes effort for that equity, right? I have to really engage people and understand that they have different unique needs, that uniqueness that we talked about, that is diversity. Next slide. So we talk about inclusion as a one-word theme, success. Honda used to say that diversity is a reality and inclusion is a choice. What we mean by that is those who choose to involve, recognize, utilize, appreciate, connect, mentor, develop that rich diversity in problem solving, decision making, product development, ideation, will be more successful than those who don't. Who knows what the term atrophy means? Can you verbalize that for me?
When you don't use a muscle and it dies off.
That's right. Death due to non-use. And guess what? That's what lack of inclusion does to an organization. People die on the vine. They become a cancer, passive aggressive. They take everybody down with them because they're not being valued, appreciated, mentored, developed, connected, appreciate all those things, or they'll leave and they go where they are, right? And remember, our society is going to be more and more diverse, majority minority by 2060. So this is a fact. And those who get in front of this inclusion game and understand that it leads to success are going to be better off than those school districts that do not. And with that multicultural inclusionary policy, and with hiring a diversity coordinator, and with rolling out this diversity, equity, inclusion plan that the district rolled out with, you guys are well positioned for that success. If you don't point to the poster on the wall that says inclusion, and you instead act it, model it, breathe it, live it every day. So next slide, we're going to get into implicit bias. It's called schemas, sort of the biological name for this thing we call implicit bias is schemas. Non-conscious expectations or biases associated with members of a group that guide expectations and behaviors. And actions based on schemas, or these implicit bias, is pervasive and inevitable. So one lesson, if you don't take anything away from this workshop, take this away. Everybody has bias. The goal is to not eliminate bias because that's impossible. The goal is to help people identify the biases when they pop up and manage them so that they don't do the last sentence. Schemas can be distorting and result in poor judgment. So we don't want these schemas or this implicit bias to give poor judgment and lead to bad decisions based solely on your stereotypical biases, right? Our brain up at top. If you have a brain, you have bias. Our brain constantly seeks what it recognizes as comfort, safety, and the path of least resistance. And I'll explain why that's true in the next slide. No, go back to the other one. I'm sorry. So, trick question. Time constraints, uncertainty, fear, fatigue, stress. I'll throw in hunger. They all point to that red box called unconscious bias. So trick question, does anybody experience any of those things during their day? Anybody? If the answer is yes, then you are triggering your unconscious or implicit biases every time those factors surrounding that red square pop up. And so it will happen, it's inevitable. Our goal is to help you identify and manage them. So next slide. Everyone has them. What you see on social media, the music you listen to, conversations at the dinner table, in the break room at work, where you go to church, where you go to school, what side of the town or railroad tracks you live on, those all shape our biases. Next prompt talks about how our brain
Hey,
constantly.
Steve, there was a question. It looks like, how is race eliminated? Please expound upon what you meant about this statement.
How is race eliminated?
I think that Scott's response was to the question around what changed from the definition from one to the other.
Oh, sorry, I just saw it now.
Race was eliminated from the definition.
Yeah, the words race or gender weren't used in that proposed definition, and that's on purpose to get people away from, again, defaulting to the things we all default to when we think of diversity as race and gender, and think more about what's intangible, inert inside of us, essentially who we are, that we can't see. So the next prompt says, implicit bias developed from human need to process abundance of information quickly. 11 million bits with an M of information every moment is barraged or stuffed into our brain, but our brain can only consciously process 40 bits of those 11 million bits of information every moment. So you can see how our brain is constantly struggling for convenience, safety, and comfort, passive least resistance, right? So to process that, it uses shortcuts, connections, to make these connections between these bits of information. Unfortunately, these shortcuts lead to harmful stereotypes when applied to people and circumstances. Now, implicit biases don't make us good people or bad people. They make us biased people. Everybody is biased. Bias is not a bad word. It's not a bad word. Trust me. It's how we act or fail to act upon what we do or don't do because of our biases that can lead to harm, injury, yes, even death. And I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine who I've sat on panels with, her name is Erin Reeves. She's an implicit bias expert out of Chicago, PhD. She did an experiment with the Chicago Police Department and put their gun for 2 days, I think it was, on their non-dominant side of their holster, right? So that they would have to maybe a split second or second before they actually got their gun out of their holster. The goal of this exercise was to demonstrate how it caused them to think a little bit more about what they were doing before they used deadly force, right? And that could save lives, particularly when unarmed people are involved, which you've seen a lot in the media these days, unarmed folks getting shot. In Columbus, we had a gentleman, Goodson, bringing home Subway sub sandwiches and got shot right in front of his house. Now, I guarantee you that if you put certain things on Subway sandwiches, they can be deadly. But I don't see how that officer was in fear for his life when he was trying to bring lunch home to his family. This was an off-duty police officer that followed him to his residence, stalked him down and shot him. Andre Hill raised a phone in his garage at night, trying to prove, I guess, that he didn't have a weapon, but instantly, when they saw this black man raising something, they associated a weapon with it and shot him dead. So that's the kind of thing that happens when we don't have that split second to think about what we're doing. Needless to say, the Chicago police didn't institute that policy because it did expose the life of the police officers to more danger. But the point was made through the experiment. And finally, allowing these implicit biases and negative stereotypes to run rampant in the workplace or in the schoolhouse is harmful and reduce diversity and inclusion within that environment. So I think the next slide, it has types of implicit bias. Could someone read for me really loud so everybody can hear affinity bias?
Affinity bias, a bias tending to be more receptive to people who resemble our lives in some way or remind us of ourselves or of those in our familiar surroundings, race, gender, age, geography.
you remind me of myself when I was a kid, and I know your dad, you're a chip off the old block. I'm gonna promote you to vice president just because of that, right? Maybe not because of their competence, but because they remind me of me when I was a young buck, right? Somebody read confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, a bias that looks and searches for information to support a belief, view, or position, and that in the process often ignores details, facts, and clear evidence to the contrary.
This is proof of the mind really searching for that comfort, convenience, and safety. It's been barraged with these stereotypes, and the brain wants to search for facts that supports that stereotype, not the facts that are staring it in the face to the contrary. So my firm is developing a workshop called Fake News, also known as confirmation bias. So when you hear the words fake news used, and you can Google this, Google fake news and then confirmation bias in the same phrase, and they will come up and explain how fake news is another way of people searching for confirmation bias to support their extreme beliefs. But clear facts to the contrary are staring them in the face, and yet your brain seeks for that stereotype that supports that stereotype. Ignore the facts. It wants alternative facts to support its stereotype. Somebody read halo effect.
A bias that likes or admires something about a certain person, group, or thing that causes one to assume that everything about that person, group, or thing is better, great, wonderful, or without fault.
Maybe this is a blonde hair type thing, blue eyes type thing. Tattoos. Everybody that has tattoos, we're cool. Everybody that rides motorcycles, we're cool. Perception bias, a bias that stereotypes people, places, or things based on who they belong to or associate with. The one that I relate this to is sororities or fraternities, right? Your sorority sister, your fraternity brother, they're in like Flint on principle, just because they're in the frat or in the sorority. In group bias, we tend to provide advantages to members of groups we most identify with. Bandwagon bias, a bias that causes one in a familiar group or association to believe something by default. I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. I got bandwagon bias. They're the greatest team on the face of the earth. They're going to win the Super Bowl, baby. So that's kind of how that works, right? So we're going to have a video that further illustrates how implicit bias works.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Thank you, Carrie. I hope that helped. You know, when I say peanut butter, you automatically say jelly, right? Because of that association. Those sketch faces that you saw in the video, that's part of an implicit association test or an IAT test. I don't know if any of you have taken that, but it asks you to split second associate those faces with good, bad, positive, negative. And I recommend that you take the IAT if you haven't. There's various tests that you can use. It's from the Harvard Business School. Also, you heard him say blind spot bias. You know, oh yeah, I'm not biased. There's plenty of people that are, but I'm not biased. Remember, I said everybody has bias. It's impossible to eliminate them. It doesn't make you good or bad. So one other illustration I'd like to use. Can anybody say out loud what is the color of this paper? Take your mute off, please.
White.
White.
Say it again. What's the color of the paper?
White.
Please unmute yourselves. What's the color of this paper?
White.
White.
Say it again.
White.
White.
What do cows drink?
Milk.
Milk.
All right. So what I've just demonstrated in real time is the same type of association that you saw with peanut butter and jelly. I dare say that cows drink their own milk, right? However, I told you the white paper, I had you repeat white, and I asked you about a cow, and the first thing that's white that you think of when you think of a cow is milk. And so that's how our brain kicks in immediately. It doesn't want to think about, wow, what do cows really drink? In fact, I've heard that cows drink beer and a lot of it. But anyway, because they drink grain, right? You know how beer is made from grain, right? I'm just kidding. Anyway, you see how the implicit bias works in real time. And I just showed you a white piece of paper, right? So that fog that everybody breathes in every day, all day, when we're not even realizing it, that's how your implicit bias works. Any questions, comments? All right, let's go to the next slide. Systemic bias is less about violence or burning crosses than it is about everyday decisions made by people who may not even think of themselves as biased or racist. Remember that I'm not racist, everybody else is racist. A sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, said, the main problem nowadays is not the folks with the hoods, but the folks dressed in suits. Another way that I've heard this said is, while Jim Crow is no longer around, he's dead. Jim Crow has a lot of grandkids and great grandkids running around in suits, right? Not in hoods. Systemic bias persists in our schools, offices, court systems, police departments, and elsewhere. When one group of people occupy most positions of decision-making power, regardless of the race, gender, sexual orientation of that group, the other people have a difficult time getting a fair shake, let alone getting ahead. So this bias thing, the systemic bias, is based on really who's in charge and making decisions. And those other people are going to have a tough time because of that bias, of that group thing. We all have to do a better job of identifying and eliminating bias. I believe that if you eliminate systemic bias, it's better to start with that because you save people from their subjective selves, and then you can train people and work on their individual implicit biases. But I believe it's a great start to examine the biases and systems that tend to cause people to lean on that bias system as the reason why they make those biased decisions. And then you can start working on the individual itself. Next slide. These are just images that factoids that I'll just share with you how systemic bias plays out in wealth, employment, education, and I want to spend a little time on the education. Black students are 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended for the same infractions. I had a personal experience with this. Young Black boys in school systems are considered to be aggressive and troublemakers. And so they were always disciplined when they were just being themselves. Boys will be boys, right? And so my Black boys got unfair attention for being troublemakers, too aggressive, disturbing the class, when maybe it's the teacher's job to understand how to best instruct those active students in a way that engages them based on who they are. The next slide, we have 4 other categories of systemic bias: healthcare, surveillance, criminal justice, and housing. The surveillance is sort of the driving while Black. Black drivers are 30% more likely to be pulled over. Healthcare, one study found that 67% of doctors have a bias against African-American patients. You've seen Serena Williams, and I think other stars give their testimony about how they have had disparities in their healthcare treatment. So it doesn't matter how much of a star you are, you can have medical, what they call medical apartheid, based on how some physicians treat Black patients. Here's another example of it. Morphine for cancer patients. I've had oncologists tell me, Black oncologists, that doctors are very liberal in prescribing morphine for white cancer patients, but then they hide behind the excuse of the opioid regulations for an excuse not to prescribe morphine for that Black cancer patient that's in just as much pain as the white cancer patient. Criminal justice, that gets to Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow Prison Industrial Complex, how disproportionately Blacks make up more of the prison population, but they only have 13% of the general population. Any questions about those factoids? All right, let's go to the next one. Now, I want each of you to pull out a piece of paper, and we're going to have a active participation with this Trusted 10 exercise. So I'll give you 30 seconds to grab a piece of paper and a pen. Unmute yourself and say, I got it when you got it, okay?
I got it. Got it.
Got it.
Got it.
Got it.
Got it.
All right, I want you to draw 6 columns down that piece of paper. And I want you to number the rows 1 through 10, 10 rows.
Okay.
And I want you to put the first name only of the people that you implicitly trust. These are your trusted top 10 people. They cannot be a family member, either immediate family or extended family, no family members. These are your trusted 10 circle of associates outside of your family that you trust with the shirt off your back, that you Listen to everything they say, that they're your sage and your muse, that you trust them implicitly. Up to 10 names, because I know it's probably hard to get 10 names outside of your family members, but list those first names only in that first column. Unmute and tell me when you're done.
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 Done. Done.
All right, the second column, I want you to put the gender of that trusted 10 person that you named in column 1. The gender of your trusted 10. M for male, F for female.
How about GNB for gender non-binary?
Go for it.
Thank you.
The next column, I want you to put the age as close as you can determine it of your trusted 10 person that you've listed. The age. All right. The next column, ethnicity of your trusted 10. Race, which is not real, or ethnicity of the trusted 10. All right, next column is sexual orientation of the trusted 10. Sexual orientation of the persons you listed as your trusted 10. Final category or column I want you to complete is the marital status, married or single, of your trusted 10, married or single. Now, your trusted 10 is for you and your own personal edification. However, if any of you would like to share at a high level your observations, and I'd welcome you to put your observations below where there's this notes thing below. Just write a sentence to tell yourself what that trusted 10 list speaks to you, what jumps out at you. But if anybody would like to verbally share that, the floor is yours. What takeaways do you have from your trusted 10 list?
They're almost all very much like me.
Yes. I'm going to say I have a lack of diversity in my list with a couple of outliers.
Couple of exceptions.
Yes.
Yeah, the takeaway, the big takeaway from this, and again, this is not exclusive to any race, gender, sexual orientation, but regardless of who you are, you tend to gravitate towards that sameness based on the people that you trust, your inner circle of folks, right? And again, this is a spotlight on the fact that biases don't make us good people or bad people. It just makes us biased people. We gravitate towards sameness. However, if we're going to be really good at this thing called inclusion and equity and diversity, we need to work hard based on what we see from this trusted 10 list to broaden our circle, right? Broaden our circle of influence, the people that we confide in, the people that we, again, it gets into the, when faced with differences, be curious. Seek to find out what makes people tick that are different than you. Go outside your comfort zone, right? So that you will be better. Your core competency will be higher in this area. You will be better at this critical success factor called diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? You will be better at carrying out that multicultural and inclusionary policy of the City of Dublin school system. I hope that was helpful. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the end of our session, and we'll end it with just some discussion with these two scenarios. Like the workplace, school can be the first or only place where some students, teachers, counselors, principals, parents, whatever, others encounter a diverse and varied society. That prevents opportunities for enlightenment and potentially for misunderstanding. Schools become a laboratory almost, or a place to learn not just geometry and grammar, but also community building and social interaction. So with this first scenario, it's called That's So Gay. It's a casual insult heard in schools everywhere. One teacher says whenever she hears such language in the classroom, she asks, what was homosexual about it? So you see what she did there? She twisted that's so gay into the technical term. Well, wait a minute, tell me, Johnny, what was homosexual about it? Almost suggesting the proper way to refer to that type of person that you're trying to, demean. So then she uses the moment to discuss the use of slang and derogatory slurs, including racist and sexual language. They know in their hearts that they are wrong by using that word that way. I just needed someone to stop them in their tracks. So if you were a parent, which you are, and your Johnny or your Susie came home and said, they heard this or overheard that, or somebody directed this comment to them, how would you react as a parent? And how would you react as school staff? Put yourself in the shoes of school staff. How should they respond if something like that is said? And I'll just leave it open to you guys to give me your thoughts. You got a dog right there. That's cool.
I would want my child's teacher to react the way that this teacher did.
Use it as a teaching moment. Now, what's going to happen when she asks Johnny that question? What's so homosexual about it? Is he going to go into an explanation as to what he meant? Probably not. He's going to realize that what he said was inappropriate. And that's that zero tolerance. Everybody has to model it, live it, breathe it. And, you know, when Johnny comes home and says, the teacher called me out, and Johnny says, well, the parent says, well, what did you say? Well, I said, that's so gay. You know, everybody says that. Well, it's up to the parent to say, Johnny, that's not cool. You know, that's offensive. And so the parent should not want Johnny to be saying those kinds of things in the classroom, and should support what the teacher did versus storming down to the school saying, how dare you call my Johnny out, right? Any other thoughts on that scenario?
Yeah, I can remember being in middle school or high school and using that phrase as a teenager, and my mom stopping us and saying, I have gay friends, like, why would you say that? That could be offensive to them. And she called us out on it. And I don't know if it was just the cool term that we were using at that time as teenagers, but she stopped us.
I just want to add to that. I have a gay child, and it's interesting to see this reappropriation of the term, saying, you know, here are my child and their friends, they will use that term with each other, but I can't, you know, it's not allowed outside of that community, in using the term gay or using gay in this way. But I agree with the scenario of the teacher saying, hey, well, what is it about that makes it what's so homosexual about it? And I think it's a teaching moment as well. And it would open up a discussion in the classroom about language and how we use language and what's deemed appropriate and inappropriate, and why certain communities, it's okay, like thinking about my child and their use of language within their subculture, within their gay community. Thank you.
If I was a teacher in the Dublin schools right now, though, I would not be willing to, or, you know, feel encouraged or feel like I could call out a child for that, because I would be afraid that the parent is going to march down to my classroom and not, you know, tell me that it's not my business and it's not my responsibility to be doing that. So like, that's where I think we really need to figure out a way to support the teachers in what the schools will back them up on handling in the classroom and these types of scenarios, and maybe specific training for them on, this is how you should handle these situations, and this is how we will back you up if you handle the situation in the way you've been trained to handle. And then that they would push back on parents that have an issue with that, because they should feel like they can address it in the classroom in a way that is supportive to everybody involved. But I don't think that that's the case right now.
And thank you for that comment, but rhetorical question. Would the way that teacher handled that situation be on all squares with that multicultural and inclusionary policy? I argue it is. And so if that policy is lived, breathed, and enforced, that teacher should have psychological safety to call that student out in a very professional way, using it as a teaching moment and just asking the innocent question. Well, tell me, Johnny, what was so homosexual about it? Not with attitude, well, what was so homosexual about it? You know, obviously there's a way to ask it, right? Any other comments? Let's go to scenario 2. You're so white. And this is applicable in particular to Dublin City Schools, because while I said there's 23% Asian population in Dublin, the Black population, the African-American population isn't that big. Trust me, I know, having lived there over 20 years. from a 20-year-old African-American college student in South Carolina, I've been called an Oreo all my life. Oh, you're Black on the outside, but you're white on the inside. Or you're so white. A Black high school student in Pennsylvania wears braids to school, sitting in the cafeteria. Some other Black students speak loudly about her. She really thinks she's Black now, you know, that she's got these braids, right? The student says she often is called too white by other Blacks. Some Native Americans, Latinos, and gay students have also been accused by their peers of being too Native, too ethnic, too queer. You know, there's a lot of struggle with that, I assume. And so what would parents do when they have to deal with their sons or daughters being called Oreo? You know, there is this need to adapt to an environment where they are a minority, but to still not assimilate and still be themselves, right? Sometimes unfairly, bigotry, the last sentence, comes from those who belong to our own identity groups. So we've got a complexity within this bias that we're biased within our own groups, calling people out as not being to this or enough that. Barack Obama, prime example, our first Black president. He wasn't Black enough for a lot of Blacks, and he was too white for a lot of Blacks. And he was too Black for a lot of white folks, right? So, I mean, he couldn't win. He was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. So any thoughts about that, how parents should react to those kinds of Oreos, or you're too white, or you know?
I think it just comes back to the comments you had about, or the definition of diversity and uniqueness, and celebrating our uniqueness. You know, my children are very different and have different qualities, and we celebrate those things. It's hard though, you know, as a parent, I feel like you can create a safe space in your home, but it's hard at school and in the community. So I don't have a solution except trying to give our children to go confidently in their uniqueness.
You know, the underlying lesson in this is we are not monolithic people, right? Whether we're LGBTQ, Hispanic, Native American, Black, white, we're not monolithic. So don't try to group us into this big box and expect us to act the way that you think we should act if we're Black or white or LGBTQ. You know, let us identify ourselves. Let us be who we are for our own reasons. Don't judge, don't stereotype, don't impose your bias on me. That's not cool. Any other thoughts?
Steve, I think it goes into, you know, what we were talking about earlier about buy-in within our own communities. Thinking about how Barack Obama is perceived as too white. Is it because of the way he spoke, again, or how we use language? Was it because of the shade of his skin color? Was it because of his education level? So how within communities do we say it's okay, it's important to have education, right? And it's not being, that doesn't make us too white within communities of color, and buying into that. And how do you educate folks to understand that?
That's a good point. Thanks, Peggy.
You're welcome.
Any other comments or thoughts?
I would just like to add, probably a lot of the people on this call already know about this, but there's an Instagram account out there called Dear Dublin, Ohio, where students that minority students that went to Dublin schools have documented some of their experiences with racism in our school system. I certainly found it extremely eye-opening. I'm sure others would also if they haven't been on there already. But I think it's something that we need to identify that it exists before we can start to address it moving forward or continue to address it moving forward.
I see some stuff in the chat box, and thank you for your comments. Well, Carrie, let's run the last video, and that will be the final thing for our workshop today. I know we ran over, and I apologize for that, but I thought the discussion was very rich and beneficial. This is called putting people in boxes.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark. All that we share.
Many of you may have seen a version of that video before, but the end message was there's all of us, and there's all of us who just love Denmark. I'm sure there's all of us on this call who just love Dublin City Schools or Dublin, the city of Dublin, right? That's the common denominator that brings us all together, yet we put people in boxes, right? And try to segregate them from the commonality that brings us all together. So there's more that we have in common than we think. Any observations or questions or comments about the video?
I think this exercise should be done at every school once a year.
I'd be happy to do that. Maybe we can talk to Todd Holy and figure out how we can do that.
I think that'd be wonderful because it does show that, they're a lot alike. The kids are a lot alike and are going through the same things. And I also, and again, with the disabilities, I think they should be included. I know it's hard to include everybody in every subject, but I just think they should be a little more included also because my son's high functioning autism and he gets excluded in a lot because of that. And like this exercise would show him and show others that he is a lot like them.
I have a couple of clients. One is Ability Matters, Ohio, that's in Dublin off of Metro Place. And they specialize in supporting adults on the autism spectrum. And I also have a client, oh wow, I forgot that quick. But anyway, they really focus on mainstreaming. Oh, Flying Horse Farms. I don't know if many of you have heard of Flying Horse Farms.
I have.
And it's like a transformational experience where folks with serious illnesses, it's like that equity, right? They don't start at the same starting place, but they all get a chance to do the zip line, even if they're in a wheelchair, or, climb that rock wall, even if they have sickle cell or whatever the case may be. So, disability or different ability is very, very key in the diversity spectrum. And those are things that won't go unmissed, trust me.
Thank you.
Well, that's all I have, unless you have any closing questions or comments. I've really enjoyed our session today. I hope that your bank account is a little bit fuller than it was before, and you can make some withdrawals as you sit at home talking to your students and your teachers about some of this important work.
Is this going to be taped so we can show our kids?
It has been recorded, and probably sometime by this weekend, we'll have that up on the YouTube channel for PERC.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much, Steve, for this session. It was great. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of chat thank yous coming in as well. So just really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend with our Dublin community this morning.
Well, Dublin community has a big place in my heart, even though I don't live there anymore. It's a part of who I am. So happy to do it.
All right. And everyone who's here, please spread the word. We'll be having this same session at 7 p.m. tonight. So anyone that you know that wasn't able to come, please encourage them to attend at 7 p.m.
And thank you for your tech support, Carrie.
Absolutely. It worked out. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the call now. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.